very much anticipated by these businesses, and we'll have to see and wait for the details.
And here is the Prime Minister of Canada. Thanks for that, Bashi.
Stepped up to keep each other safe. And because of those actions and those choices, in many parts of the country, we're getting this virus under control. Now, that doesn't mean we can let down our guard. But what our progress does mean is that where it's safe to do so, we can gradually and carefully restart some of our activities. For many small business owners and their workers, being able to reopen is welcome news. Of course, this is not without its challenges. People need help getting back on their feet. That's why we brought in new, targeted support to get businesses going again. Use the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy to rehire your workers. Access a loan through the Canada Emergency Business Account to adapt to new realities, and contact your regional development agency where we've boosted funding if you don't qualify for other supports. Thousands of business owners have already navigated the process and are getting the help they need. And if you're not one of them yet, we're making it simpler to find out what's available. Go to the COVID-19 page at canada.ca. You'll find a section that lays out all the programs based on what your need is, from rehiring staff to accessing credit. Your business matters to your employees and to our country. In fact, it matters to our whole economy. So, a concern for you is a concern for us, too. And that brings me to the question of your rent. Paying rent on your space might be a problem right now. We hear that, so we're taking action. We're creating the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. This benefit will provide forgivable loans to landlords so that they can reduce by 75% the rent for small business tenants that have lost the majority of their revenue because of COVID-19. If you're a landlord and you and your tenant are eligible, please apply. Go to cmhc.ca to get the details on what information you'll need when the application portal opens starting May 25th. Once this launches, you'll receive your relief quickly. Our government, along with the provinces and territories, will cover 50% of the rent. We're asking that landlords absorb 25% and tenants pay the rest with the support of programs like the CEBA. For larger retailers, we're also working on a new support, and we'll have more details to share soon. These are challenging times, but together we can protect jobs and make sure that our economy bounces back, and that will be good for everyone.
We are in the process of introducing the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. As part of this program, landlords will be able to receive a forgivable loan to reduce by 75% the rent paid by small business tenants, and if they've lost the majority of their revenues. Go to the site of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation to see what you need to apply to the program once the portal launches on May 25th. You will receive the support you need soon afterwards. Our government, along with the provinces and territories, will be covering 50% of the rent. We are asking landlords to cover 25%, and tenants will have to pay the rest through programs such as the Emergency Business Account. For larger retailers, we are in the process of developing new support measures, and we'll have additional details on that very soon. Together, we can protect jobs and take action to ensure that our economy makes a strong recovery. And that is good for everyone.
Whether you work at the restaurant around the corner or at an office downtown, your job is how you support yourself and your family. And no matter what you do, no matter how many other people your workplace employs, we need to protect that. In addition to our support for small businesses, we've also brought in help for companies of every size. Last week, we launched the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility to provide bridge loans for the country's largest employers. As of today, applications for this financing are open. These loans will be delivered through the Canada Development Investment Corporation in cooperation with Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada and the Department of Finance. Our priority is that this program be fair and effective. Loans will be designed with a clear goal: protecting jobs and helping our economy rebound. Businesses can go online to cdev.gc.ca for more information on the application process. But I want to be clear, we are not offering companies a bailout. We are making loans available so that they can weather this storm and continue to employ millions of hardworking Canadians.
Starting today, businesses can apply to receive funding through the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility. For more information on the application process, businesses are invited to go online and consult the cdev.gc.ca website. These loans will be granted through the Investment Development Corporation of Canada in cooperation with Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada and the Department of Finance. Our priority will be to ensure that the program is fair and effective. So we have set ourselves a very specific goal: protecting jobs and helping the economy to rebound quickly. But I want to be clear, this is not a blank check for businesses. We are granting loans so that they can get through the crisis and continue to employ millions of Canadians right across the country.
No matter who you are or where you live, we're here to support you. So I want to end this morning by reminding parents that when you receive your Canada Child Benefit payment today, it will include an extra $300 per child. This is money to help you through this very tough time.
Wherever you are or wherever you live, we are there for you. I just want to close this morning by reminding parents that when you receive your Canada Child Benefit today, you will be receiving $300 more per child. This is money to help your family get through this difficult period. And I'd just like to say a few words to parents. It's not easy raising children these days, but you're all doing a great job. Despite all the challenges out there and the problems we are facing together as a society, our parents are doing a wonderful job every single day. So continue your great work, and we will be there to support you. Together, we will get through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phone for questions. One question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. *1 for questions. Étoile 1 pour des questions. Première question, l'inaudible, la presse canadienne. À vous.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. Monday, we should be seeing the House reopen. I'm not sure that's what you want. That's what the Conservatives want. And you seem to have lost your last ally, the NDP. Now, the Bloc Québécois is also asking for specific things. Will you give them this so that Parliament can return normally? And what I'm talking about are changes to certain programs and help for small businesses. I'd just like to correct you, Lena. We definitely want to continue to defend our democratic institutions and to ensure that our Parliament is working. That's very important, not in spite of this crisis, but because of this crisis. We need to have a Parliament that works. And for a number of weeks now, we have been getting together 3 times a week, twice virtually and once in person, to allow members of Parliament from right across the country to ask their questions, to make a contribution. And since the beginning of this crisis, those contributions from all the different parties have helped us to shape support correctly to help millions and millions of Canadians. So, yes, we definitely want the work of Parliament to continue in the House of Commons. And right now, there are discussions happening between the parties as to what the best way to do that would be, given COVID-19. And those conversations are continuing. But I can point out to you that all parties, including the Liberal Party, want us to have an opportunity to ensure that Parliament is working properly.
I think, laisse-moi dire en anglais, Lina, juste une seconde. I think the important thing that we have seen over these past weeks is that our Parliament continues to function. We've been meeting 3 times a week, twice virtually, once in person, to ensure that MPs from right across the country continue to be able to share the concerns of their constituents, ask questions of the government and its programs, and also highlight solutions that will help Canadians as we move forward. And from the beginning, we've had tremendous input from all parties that has helped us make sure we're getting it right to help millions of Canadians right across the country in this moment of crisis. We want to make sure that we are functioning as an effective Parliament during this time, not in spite of the crisis, but because of the crisis. And that's why we're working right now with other parties in the House to try and figure out what the best way for us to move forward, to continue our democratic processes, to continue to have a strong functioning Parliament and democracy, while at the same time ensuring that we're keeping everyone safe.
Follow up? Lina, follow up?
Okay.
Pour les petites entreprises, êtes-vous prêt à bouger
No,
là-dessus?
for small businesses.
Pardon,
Are you
Lina, je pense
prepared
que vous
to
aviez
do
été
more?
coupée au
I'm
début.
sorry, you
Pouvez-vous
were cut
répéter
off
votre
at the
question?
beginning, Lina. Could you repeat your question? Sorry. Yeah, it's not working so well today. So, I was saying, the Bloc Québécois is asking for specific things, that you make changes to the emergency response benefit and more help for small businesses. Now, you said you would be doing something, but it hasn't happened. So, will you accede to the request being made by the Bloc Québécois? Well, we are continuing to show a lot of flexibility about the emergency benefit. We know we need to help more Canadians, and that's what we're doing by working with the other parties and with Canadians. With respect to fixed costs, the biggest one is businesses' rent. And the announcement we're making today regarding the commercial rent assistance program for small businesses will help a great many of them out there. But we're continuing our discussions with all the political parties to have a functioning Parliament.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Jenny Tashagumskum, APTN. Line open.
Hi. Good morning, Mr. Prime Minister. Sorry, having a problem with my phone here. So, with provinces and economies opening up, First Nations communities are remaining closed. Now, do you support these extra measures? Even though they create tensions with nearby jurisdictions?
From the very beginning, our focus has been on keeping Canadians safe, with particular emphasis on people who are more vulnerable. And we've seen that because of challenges around health delivery, existing challenges and inequalities, Indigenous communities across the country are at a greater vulnerability to COVID-19 than others. That's why we put in place measures early on to help these communities protect themselves and be supported in this pandemic time. We know that as economies start to reopen, as activity picks up across the country, we're going to have to make, and local jurisdictions will have to make very careful decisions about how and where to reopen. And we need to make sure that every step of the way, people are working with all local stakeholders, including and specifically Indigenous communities and leadership, to ensure that we're not bringing in greater risks. As much as we want the economy to reopen and things to get back to normal, we need to put the safety and security of all Canadians at the forefront of everything we do.
And a follow-up, Jamie?
Thank you. And as a follow-up, just on a different note, this pertains more to federal than provincial prisons. But in terms of early release programs, getting inmates with a history of respiratory illnesses out of jail, now with the relaxing of restrictions, is that not a priority anymore? And I was wondering, will Minister Blair be at the committee update today, or when will he be there?
We've continued to look very closely at how we can ensure that federal institutions like our correctional facilities are kept safe. We're looking at various measures and have brought in a number of measures to keep both inmates and staff at those facilities safe. We continue to adjust as time goes on, and as things become more necessary or less necessary, we will stay active on a daily basis.
Thank you. Next question, operator.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Christy Kirkup, the Globe and Mail. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. You've addressed the issue of increased economic activity today. Spain has made the mandatory wearing of masks, except for children. Is the mandatory wearing of masks being considered by Canada's Committee of Chief Public Health Officers from across the country?
I know public health authorities are continually looking at the research and looking at the best way for Canadians to protect themselves. I believe they will have further recommendations on masks in the coming hours. The reality is the best thing for people to do is to remain socially distanced, to keep 2 meters apart, to stay at home wherever possible, and to wash your hands regularly and frequently. But in situations where you cannot physically distance to 2 meters, people are encouraged to wear masks, and I will allow public health authorities to make that announcement a little later today. Okay.
I believe that we all know that the best way to protect ourselves is to keep 2 meters distance from others and to remain at home as much as possible. But in situations where we cannot do that and we cannot keep our 2 meters distance from others, it can be helpful to wear a mask. The Public Health Agency of Canada will be making an announcement in the coming hours on this matter.
Just a follow-up. Thank you. Just as a follow-up, Prime Minister, you have been seen wearing a mask, including in your office, for example. Can you just paint a picture for Canadians about your personal approach to mask wearing? When are you wearing a mask? How are you wearing a mask?
Obviously, everyone's situation will be different, and we always need to pay attention to public health authorities. When it is possible for me to keep 2 meters distance from people, that is what I prefer to do. In situations where I'm either walking through the halls of Parliament or going to my office and coming in proximity to people, I've chosen to start wearing a mask. I will be wearing a mask as I go into Parliament this afternoon for our in-person sitting. Once I am at my desk in Parliament and 2 meters separate from everyone else, I will take off my mask so I can engage in parliamentary discourse. But as soon as I leave my seat and walk past people and walk through potentially busier hallways, I will be wearing a mask. That's my personal choice. That is aligned, I think, with what public health is recommending. I think we all need to adjust to what works in our circumstances and keep safety at the forefront of what we're doing.
I think every person will make his or her own decision about their behavior while at the same time following public health advice, we hope. But in my case, when I move through parliamentary buildings, and I will be going to Parliament later for the in-person session, when I'm walking down the hallways or when I go into the House of Commons, I will be wearing a mask. When I get to my seat, because there will be 2 meters distance between me and my colleagues, I will take it off in order to take part in question period, and upon leaving, I will put it back on again. I do that when I'm moving around because it's not always that easy to keep 2 meters distance from others, and in such cases, I want to wear a mask. But I'm inviting Canadians to reflect on how they can protect themselves and protect others while following public health advice.
Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Marie Vastel, Le Devoir. À vous.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur
Good
Trudeau.
morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to come back to parliamentary work. It's been 6 weeks now, more than 6 weeks, that Parliament has been suspended. but we're also talking about 6 weeks of virtual sessions. Now, the Bloc is talking about coming back sooner in order to make up for lost time. Now, do you think it's absolutely necessary to make up for the lost time? Well, I think those are things we're all thinking about and that we'll be discussing with the other parties. Of course, we had an election platform on which we were elected, and we would like to deliver on that platform. At the same time, we know that COVID-19 has resulted in profound changes in the way the country is working in 2020, so there will be adjustments made. And when it comes to Parliament, whether it's for next month or the months to come, we are now in discussion with the other parties, and I think it's important that we continue to sit. For a number of weeks now, we've been sitting 3 times a week, virtually and in person, and that's been extremely important, and we need to continue to allow members of Parliament to do their job. Follow up? I'd like to ask for a clarification. I understand that there are discussions underway, but you personally, do you believe that the lost time has to be recovered this summer? Or do you think it still won't be time to do that because of the crisis? What are your personal views as to the next possible scenario? Well, that will really depend on our discussions with the other parties and how well we can move forward with important pieces of legislation in the coming months. Which bills will need to be introduced in the coming months and so forth. I would like to be more clear, but the fact is that the situation changes from week to week, and it is possible that we will have to meet more frequently as a Parliament so that we can do what needs to be done and ensure that all Canadians are safe and healthy. Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada, with respect to the House of Commons. Now, there is one request that's being made, and that is regarding the need for an economic update. The Bloc is asking for that to happen in June. Are you prepared to negotiate on that? And in terms of a hybrid Parliament, now, where there are some people sitting virtually and others in person, what do you think about that? Well, I think it's an interesting idea, and we've seen that happen in the United Kingdom, and the House of Commons has said that they could explore that option. And I think it would be a good way of allowing Parliament to sit both in person and also allow others in the regions to participate virtually so that their constituents are being represented in the House of Commons. So it's an interesting idea, and the discussions are continuing. With respect to an economic update, we have always been transparent about our investments and about what we're doing now. Certainly, things change every single week in terms of our economy, and we will certainly want to share our plans for the economy in the coming months. But, of course, we are working every single day to have a clearer idea of what could happen.
I think there's a lot of interest in a hybrid Parliament model where some people will be there in person, where others will call in via video conferencing screens. I think there are ways of making it work and ensuring that MPs from every corner of the country get to participate and make sure their citizens are reflected in the debates that go on in Parliament, and not just those who live near the National Capital Region. Obviously, these are discussions that continue, but there are models that are effective out there that we should look at adapting for Canadian use. And in regards to where our economy is going, our government has been open and transparent about all the various measures we're putting forward. It is still very difficult to predict where our economy might be 6 months from now or even 3 months from now, but we will continue to work on sharing with Canadians a picture of what the future could look like.
Now on Twitter, President Trump is talking about an in-person G7 meeting. Would you be prepared to attend? Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out the importance of the G7 and the importance of meeting with other countries in order to fight this virus and talk about the economic recovery globally. So that's very important. We need to have a meeting, and we already had a virtual meeting a few weeks ago. And it's important that we have another one in one way or another in June. With respect to the proposal of an in-person meeting, we will be looking at what the Americans are proposing. We will look at what the conditions might be, what the health protocols would be. But this is an interesting idea, but I think we need a lot more details before we can make a decision.
I think it's extremely important that we continue to have leader-level summits. We had a G7 leaders virtual meeting a few weeks ago where we talked about this important situation we're in, and we're going to need to keep talking about not just how we get through this COVID-19 pandemic, but how we restore the global economy to its rightful activities. So yes, we need to keep meeting as leaders. Whether that's virtual, in person, we'll certainly take a look at what the U.S. is proposing as host of the G7 to see what kind of measures will be in place to keep people safe, what kind of recommendations the experts are giving in terms of how that might function. There are lots of discussions to come, but we look forward to having those discussions with the American hosts.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Parry, CBC. You're asking landlords to take part in this program that you're bringing in. We've heard reports, though, of some landlords who aren't taking part, refusing to take part. Doug Ford was very forceful on this yesterday. I'm wondering, are you having conversations with the premiers about putting more pressure on landlords to try to get them to take part in this program?
I think we all understand that this is a crisis that is hitting really hard on businesses right across the country. And we know that if our economy is to come back, we need a large number of those businesses to hold on and to make it through this pandemic. That's why we are providing commercial rent assistance to landlords and tenants, and we really hope that they will take up on it. We know that if many businesses aren't able to make ends meet and do go under at this point, it'll be a lot slower to pick up the economy, and that'll be bad for Canadians, but it'll also be bad for landlords. It'll also be bad for building owners who will see a slower regaining of economic activity. And indeed, with many people discovering that we can work from home, to a much greater degree, there may be a lot of vacancies in commercial buildings over the coming months and years. Who knows exactly what the post-pandemic world will look like exactly, and that's why making sure we're supporting the businesses we have now to be able to stay in their spaces as we slowly restore our economy is going to be important, and we certainly expect landlords to be part of this solution.
We know that it's very important to ensure that the economy can make a strong recovery. There are too many businesses, too many people out there who have lost their business because they don't have the necessary support to get through this crisis. And if that happens, the recovery will be much slower and harm the entire economy. And it could also really harm landlords who own buildings. So it is our hope that building owners, landlords will take advantage of these measures to help their tenants get through this crisis so that we can recover strongly as an economy. In a crisis like this, we have to be there for each other, and that's what I expect of landlords.
Police say they've made more than 2,000 home visits for people coming back into Canada, making sure that they're complying with the self-isolation rules. You were talking yesterday about bringing in more measures when non-essential travel is allowed. Other countries have brought in monitoring devices for people coming into the country. Is that something you'd look at, or do you want to look at other options first? Where do you stand on that?
I think we know that a key part of reopening and keeping our economy going and controlling future spreads of COVID-19 will involve being very, very careful that we're not importing new cases, even as our economies open up, even as border restrictions are potentially loosened down the road. We need to make sure that we have the measures in place to be able to ensure that new cases aren't arriving and spreading through the general population. We're in discussion with the provinces and territories to ensure that we do have the capacities to do that as we look towards economic reopening. Those conversations are ongoing.
Prime Minister Janet Silver, Global News, you spoke just a moment ago about rent relief for landlords. Why not give that relief directly to the tenants? Why not just bypass the landlords if they're reluctant to start using it?
We know that the solution involves bringing different communities and groups together. The landlords need to be a part of the solution on this. We need them to understand that they do have a deep vested interest in keeping their renters in those spaces, that if more businesses go under because of COVID-19, we're all going to be worse off. And that's why this approach, in concert with the provinces, is going to be the right approach to do it. And we implore and expect landlords and building owners to understand that we all are in this together and we need to be there for each other. And this program is there to help them and to help small businesses.
And as provinces reopen and parents are expected to go back to work, childcare is an issue. I know that is a provincial matter, but I'm just wondering what discussions you may be having with provinces in terms of childcare to help out those parents, and are you concerned about the lack of childcare in this country and what impact that may have in terms of reopening the economy?
As a party, we've long been concerned about the lack of childcare spaces across this country. We know it's a challenge in the best of times for families to find that balance between care for their kids and the jobs they need to support their families. That's why when we formed government in 2015, we moved forward with historic investments in childcare agreements with the provinces to increase the accessibility of childcare. In our last platform, getting re-elected, we made more commitments on childcare of working with the provinces to invest in programs that will help more parents, more families, and grow our economies and our communities. We need to continue to do that, particularly right now, and we will be there to work with the provinces as we reopen and respond to childcare needs.
Hi, Prime Minister. Molly Thomas, CTV National News. While your government has flexed its fiscal firepower, as you call it, no government has unlimited money. So big businesses can now apply to this LEAF program for loans, and your government will ultimately choose who gets that money. So how comfortable are you in this new economy choosing the winners and the losers?
I think it's important to highlight that with the new LEAF program, the government is there as a lender of last resort. Large businesses, unlike the small businesses that we've been very generous and direct to with the Canada Emergency Business Account, large businesses have much greater access to credit on the international credit markets through the big banks, and that's why we are encouraging them to make available the credit facilities that they have right now. If they're in a situation where they cannot access that credit, they can turn to the government for funds through the LEAF program, but they are loans that come with conditions around governance, around paying proper share of taxes, around a plan for climate change. These are the kinds of things that we expect as Canadians when our taxpayer dollars go towards supporting businesses. So we are there as a program, but there are many conversations and discussions that are going to happen within companies as they look at the best way to weather this storm.
Prime Minister, switching gears a bit, the United Nations said today that Canada has an obligation to secure the urgent release and repatriation of a 5-year-old orphan girl who's in northeastern Syria, especially now with COVID posing an added threat. She has family here in Canada. What is your government going to do to get Amira out of that overcrowded refugee camp? We have been working on this file for many months now. We know that it is an extremely difficult situation for the family. We're making sure that we're going through the proper processes, but we also understand the importance of being that country that is consistently there to support people in difficulty around the world. We're trying to do our part, even in difficult situations, and I want to thank the extraordinary public servants who are working even through this pandemic to help.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
That is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Wednesday, giving his daily briefing on his government's response to COVID-19, the pandemic, telling us that there will be some news on mask wearing in this country coming up at the noon briefing from public health officials here in Ottawa after more conversations with provincial health officials. So we'll stay tuned for that because that will be important information for people. Vashi Capellas and David Cochrane join me to help with our coverage there and dissect a few things that the Prime Minister said. Let's do the commercial rent program as we were talking about before, Vashi, and then David, I'll turn to you on another issue I know you want to get into. It doesn't sound, other than sort of encouraging landlords, like there is much that can be done to force people to do this, and there is a bit of risk for landlords involved here, and of course tenants are desperately hoping that they will take advantage of the program.
Yeah, it's entirely predicated basically on the landlord's willingness to participate. And by participating, that means that the landlord has to take less money. So the federal government would help subsidize the rent and pay about 50% of it. The tenant would pay a quarter of it. And then the landlord would essentially have to eat the other quarter of it. And now that depends on a sliding scale, obviously, and the number of properties or units that the landlord has. They have to make that calculation. But some landlords have, for example, approached their tenant already and worked out a deferral system. So you have to calculate for yourself, is it better if I get the full rent a year from now or over the next year, or do I take a hit right now that might end up helping my tenant more? And so I think it depends not only on the tenant situation, but the landlord situation. And the Prime Minister got a few direct questions there about why not just direct this help to the tenants, you know, a straight line to the tenants. And that is something opposition parties, specifically the NDP, has brought up, but also the tenants themselves, saying, why are we doing it this roundabout way? And actually, I've even heard from landlords saying it would have been easier if this just got funneled through. My understanding is there will be only one sort of form for all your tenants, but it's a pretty lengthy process, and you have to make, you have to agree to a lot of stuff, that kind of thing, which is fine, but it's not something that's going to happen overnight. The only news out of the Prime Minister today on the program was that applications will open on May 25th, so that's next Monday, and that the money should flow quickly. That has been the case, to be fair to the government, with other financial aid programs, so there's no reason to think that it won't be the case this time, but the last month it does apply to is June. The question here is actually, I think, also for the provincial governments, because my understanding is only Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and this was of last week, so I could be wrong, there could be an update, but only those two provinces have put a moratorium on commercial evictions. And though you've heard, for example, in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford, you know, quote unquote, talk tough about landlords there and the way in which landlords should behave, he has not, nor have most other provinces, put a moratorium on commercial evictions. So rent is normally a provincial issue. It's provincial jurisdiction. So I think a lot of tenants, a lot of small business owners do have questions for provincial governments. In the meantime, while all these details are being worked out, can we not have a moratorium on us getting evicted because we can't pay our rent? And most provinces have come back at this point with a no. Premier Ford, for example, says he was waiting for the details on the program from the federal government before deciding whether he had to throw the hammer down even harder, I think is what he said yesterday. But for a lot of these tenants, it's too late. Like, there are businesses closed all around Ontario right now. A number of restaurants I keep seeing on Instagram every day who have had to shutter their businesses because they weren't able to make rent or they did get evicted. You know, it doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Why would a landlord, what tenant do you think you're going to get throughout a pandemic? But it is still happening. It's a reality for these tenants. And so there is a gap, I guess, in the policy from both the federal government and the provincial government to address that. But the applications will open next week. So the message from the federal government to landlords is go to cmhc.ca and start figuring out what you need to apply.
Yeah, I think, and correct me if I'm mistaken, just after my conversation with Bill Morneau from last week, because it's a jurisdictional issue, the only way the federal government could offer support to tenants was through the mortgage program. So it had to go to landlords. Yeah. Maybe there was some sort of creative way to get it to tenants, but I think they were sort of limited in terms of how they would put forward the money. And of course, landlords are worried about either being exposed with their own mortgages or worried that the business won't come back, regardless of whether they have commercial rent help. So it's a calculation that landlords have to make too, I guess, on whether they think it is worth investing. Even though the Prime Minister said, it's in everybody's interest that the economy work and landlords take this program.
Yeah, very much so. And it's not an easy calculation, as you rightly put it, Rosie, for each landlord. It depends on their situation. And I should also mention, I think I said, but it's April, May, and June.
Yeah.
So as we watch this very slow process of the economy reopening, some of the other financial aid packages, the data with them have given us sort of some insight into how slow this recovery is going to be, probably slower than we anticipated a few months ago. So even though it might help bridge, a few months for those tenants and for the landlords, there is still the problem of what happens after.
For sure.
Some of those businesses haven't even opened yet, and thinking specifically of restaurants, right? They're in the last phase of so many provinces. There's only a few in which those restaurants are open. They're operating at 50% capacity, which means revenues are down. So it just keeps getting more complicated. There's no quick fix, but certainly these 3 months are, I think there is a desire to participate in the program, and it'll be really interesting to see what the uptake is like.
The Prime Minister also, of course, talked about the LEAF program, the large enterprise money. I just wanted to highlight that because he made it very clear, his language has been consistent through that this is a loan program, not a bailout. This is to get you through the crisis, and that's sort of it. David, you want to talk about some child benefit that the Prime Minister mentioned off the top, because there was the top-up that people would have seen in their bank accounts today, but some people were surprised at what they saw in their bank accounts today.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that we're learning today. Is we've known for some time that there was going to be a one-time $300 per child top-up to the Canada Child Benefit for people. What we didn't know is that the payments are going to be expanded to people who don't normally qualify. We started getting emails and reports from people saying, I got a Canada Child Benefit top-up today and I don't ever get it normally. Do I have to pay this back? Is this a mistake? No, it's not. What apparently happened is everybody who already had a child and qualified for the Canada Child Benefit gets $300 per child. And then there's about 50,000 families that are above the normal cutoff threshold who are going to get a payment of some sort, and it's going to be scaled based on their income. So if you make too much money pre-pandemic and didn't normally qualify for a top-up for the Canada Child Benefit, if you're in those 50,000 families, you're going to get one. This is not a mistake. This was intentional. It's part of the program design, is what I'm told by government officials that I've been speaking with. It just wasn't really communicated to anybody. I went on their webpage and looked at it, and it says, who qualifies? If you have a kid and you qualify, you're getting $300, and that's all it says. Well, there's 50,000 families who are included in this to varying degrees. We've heard payments of $500, $600 to as little as like $10 or $20, depending on the household income, but people are qualifying it up to 50,000 families over and above what was anticipating that they would get the payment that was sent out today.
So don't panic if you've got a little extra cash deposited in there by the Government of Canada.
It is a feature, it is not a bug. You are meant to get this.
You were meant to get a little extra help. Okay, thank you to both of you. I will come back to you, of course. I will just say I did find it interesting to hear the Prime Minister's personal reflections on mask wearing as we wait some new information about the recommendations and the advice from public health officials. The Prime Minister saying that he is now wearing a mask, for instance, on his way to Parliament Hill, where he is headed now. He will take it off when he gets to his desk, but he will put it on again when he goes past people, and he's not sure he can maintain that 2 meters of physical distancing. So obviously he's had sort of a rethink in terms of how to best to keep other people safe around him, and certainly we're going to hear some more information around some of the advice and whether it sort of matches the Prime Minister's personal views on that. All right, we want to turn to Manitoba because they are seeing some of their communities reopen, including sites like the Forks in Winnipeg. Let's bring in Claire McKay. She's the Vice President of Corporate and Community Services with the Forks North Portage Partnership. Hi there, Claire. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you.
I will admit my pro-Winnipeg bias by getting you on today, given that I'm from there, and I do like going to the Forks when I'm back in town. But what struck me about the story that I read on our website was your approach to rent on a day when this commercial rent program has opened up. So can you give me a sense of what you decided to do for the various stalls and businesses inside the Forks?
Yeah, so when, the pandemic hit and we were looking at what was going to potentially happen over the month or coming months, we made a decision to not charge our tenants rent. And it wasn't a decision we came to lightly, but we are also an organization that has additional revenue sources. So it was something that we were able to do for our tenants. And our thought process was that we wanted them to be able to come back. We wanted them to have the best chance of being around once this pandemic was over.
So your additional revenue sources come from where? From government funding, or how are you able to make that work?
No, we're a financially self-sufficient, revenue-based organization. We are the stewards of the Forks site, which is 50 acres. We own and operate the Forks Market, but we don't own and operate the rest of the buildings on the site, and that includes the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. There's a hotel here, a children's museum, a theater for young people. We also own and operate all of the parking on the site as well, and have land leases in the rest of downtown. So while we're financially self-sufficient, we definitely have additional sources of revenue. But that also didn't mean that we weren't, affected in terms of our own teams. We laid off about 90% of our staff.
Wow. And were you able to qualify for the wage subsidy program? And is that something you're going to do moving forward?
We weren't able to qualify because of the way that we are structured.
Okay. So you've taken this personal hit on how the company works, the company that runs the Forks. Meanwhile, what is the state of the companies inside the organization, the tenants?
Well, I've spoken to every single one of them over the last couple of weeks, and we've given them the option of opening right now as restrictions ease in Manitoba. Our food vendors can open, and we just can't have seating inside. So we have a beautiful 50 acres outside that you can take your food out to, and we were able to open our outside bar as well. So far so good. We opened on Friday, and slowly tenants are starting to come back, and people are starting to come back.
Yeah. I mean, you're ahead of the game in terms of Ontario and some other places in the country. That's for sure. What are you going to do going forward for rent? So you didn't force them to pay right now, but at some point they'll have to start paying again. How are you approaching that?
Right, and we have a slightly different relationship with our tenants anyways than probably most other landlords. We are more participatory than we are probably than other places. We take percentage rent. So when there's a sale, then we will make something off that sale, and then that helps us run the building. So that's what we're looking at for now. And at some point, when it is required that everybody open, we'll be returning to more normal rents.
When you hear the Prime Minister today announcing that this portal, this application process for commercial rent will finally be open, where landlords have to take on some of the rent and tenants do, and then the governments will back some of it, but it's only starting out now. What do you make of that program? I don't know if it would have helped in your case if you would have qualified, but does it make sense for landlords, do you think?
I can't speak on behalf of other landlords, and because we do have that additional revenue source, we were able to make this decision. So, we're all in uncharted territory here. Maybe it would have helped us, and there are other tenants on the site, but I can't say for sure.
So just give me, are there people around? Are you seeing people? Are people coming to the Forks? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was a beautiful weekend here. It was 28 degrees over the weekend, and it was May long. Normally on a May long weekend, we'll have 30,000 people through the site and through the doors of the Forks Market. I would say we probably had over the entire weekend about 2,000. So people are definitely, they're coming to enjoy the public space, which is what we're mainly known for. And now they can grab a hot dog and a beer at the same time.
Okay, Claire, I did want to get you on because I found it to be a creative solution at a time when people are looking for different kinds of ways to keep going. Thanks so much for making the time today.
Thank you.
That's Claire McKay, the Vice President of Corporate and Community Services with the Forks North Portage Partnership in Winnipeg. All right, over the weekend, you may have heard the Prime Minister announce that the first clinical trials will begin on a potential vaccine here in this country. Researchers at Dalhousie University will conduct that first trial, and Dr. Joanne Langley is a vaccine investigator with the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology, and she joins me from Halifax. Hi, Doctor, good to see you.
Hi, Rosie. Thanks for having me on.
That's a pretty cool title, vaccine investigator, I must say. Tell me what you and your colleagues have managed to do so far.
Well, we do vaccine evaluation research here at the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology, and we're linked with sites all across Canada as part of the Canadian Immunization Research Network. And this is part of Canada's preparedness for emerging infectious diseases. And so we're going to be doing the phase 1, starting this particular vaccine. As soon as the vaccine is here and we have our research ethics approval, we currently have a protocol, and we have lots of people who heard the Prime Minister's announcement who are contacting us who would like to participate.
Oh, really?
We have research nurses here. We have a whole complement of staff who will greet participants and take them through this trial in a very safe and careful way.
Interesting. So do you have any sense of numbers of how many people put up their hand and said, I'm willing to try this out to see if it works?
Hundreds so far.
Wow.
That have just contacted us. We don't actually have an official notice on our website because we haven't got REB, research ethics approval, but I'm sure there will be lots. We also did the Ebola vaccine trial for Canada's a vectored vaccine, and we had thousands. And
Wow.
we actually inquired with them about why they participate. And the main reason is people want to see science advance, and they also have this altruism about helping people in another part of the world in the case of Ebola, because Ebola illness wasn't here in Canada.
Wow,
so we
that's
have lots
pretty
of
amazing.
participants.
Yeah. So of course, we've heard the Prime Minister talk about it and others talk about how far away we are from a vaccine. We know there's about 100 or so on the go in different stages around the world. What is the sort of timeline for how this will work for our clinical trial here?
So we anticipate that if all goes well, we could start enrolling participants in the next couple of weeks. Then this is a phase 1 trial, so it's an early trial. It goes slowly. We look at safety data, at 7 days, 14 days, make sure that all the participants have maintained their good health, and then we proceed with the next step of evaluation. So we're looking at different doses of vaccine and numbers of doses. So do people need 1 dose or 2 doses? And so I think at this time, in view of the pandemic, things are very accelerated. And the whole scientific community is more willing to expedite their review of data as it arises, to approve things provided they're safe and effective. So, we could even be looking at a phase 3 trial where we enroll thousands of people, potentially in 2020, I think, if all goes well.
Yeah, it has been a real story of global partnership between scientists. That's quite remarkable. How, if you were going to, I don't know if you want to put some money on it, but how long are we from a vaccine, do you think, given that there is this sort of unprecedented collaboration around the world?
Well, at the point where you're in a phase 3 trial, you're enrolling thousands, like tens of thousands, even up to 100,000. So if the emerging data from that study was reassuring, then you could actually enroll people in a rather larger phase 4 trial where it would be open to the general public, but you would still be doing monitoring to look for adverse events that occur in larger, that are very rare and that may not be identified until you've enrolled 1 million people or so. So at that point, it would really be available to a large percentage of the population. With the pandemic 2009 vaccine, the government authorized the vaccine in a special way with an interim order. So it wasn't this slow process of 10 to 15 years to approve a vaccine. So that kind of that regulatory pathway might also be available for this vaccine, given the urgent health need.
Yeah, are you, Doctor, optimistic? I don't know, maybe you need to be in your job, but are you optimistic that we'll find a solution to this?
I am optimistic. There are a lot of different vaccines being investigated, different kinds of mechanisms of engaging the immune system, different ways of presenting the antigen, and over 100 different types of products are in development. And we need all those trials because sometimes things are just surprising when they get into humans. Unexpected things happen. It doesn't work, or there's a side effect, or it's just not acceptable. It's too painful at the injection site, for example. So I am pretty confident that scientists will be able to figure out a few vaccines that will be efficacious.
I know you've worked in this field for quite some time. As you said, you worked on the Ebola vaccine. I know you worked on the pandemic plan for this country. Did you ever, did you just expect that this would happen one day, or is this all a bit surprising to you as it is to the rest of us?
It's certainly, some kind of pandemic was anticipated. Probably the scope of this with the amount of societal implication we probably didn't expect it to have this broad degree of effect on our entire population.
Yeah.
But it was on a list of things that could happen. It's just the reality of it is something different.
Yeah, that's quite right. Doctor, thank you for making the time. I know you're very busy, and I certainly don't want to take away from all of the work you're doing. And our thanks as well for doing that work. It's so important. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right, that's Dr. Joanne Langley. She's a vaccine investigator with the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology, and she is in Halifax today. We're going to take a short break now. On the other side, we'll hear from public health officials. Remember, we are expecting some sort of news on mask wearing in this country, as well as the COVID-19 sitting in Parliament. The Prime Minister will be there. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back on the other side. I'm Rosemary Barton. You're watching CBC News Network. Hi again, I'm Rosemary Barton here in the nation's capital. Thanks for joining us on CBC News Network, streaming wherever you might be in the world on our app and our website. We're here with all of your latest COVID news this hour. Ottawa has unveiled the new support for commercial landlords and tenants that will applications start to be received next week. The Prime Minister says the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program will provide forgivable loans to reduce rent by some 75% for commercial businesses. Questions are already being asked and raised, though, about whether this help might be coming too late for some businesses that may have already been forced to close because they weren't able to pay their rent. And as always, we're going to have live updates from governments across the country and health officials, too, throughout the day. Justin Trudeau also told us this morning that we can expect to hear some new direction on mask wearing from public health officials as we stand by to bring you both the briefing from our Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, and in about 15 minutes' time, the COVID committee inside Parliament, where they will be in person asking questions of the Prime Minister and various ministers. We'll bring all of that to you in the next hour. I'll bring in my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapelis, and the CBC's David Cochrane. I don't know, honestly, what we're going to hear about masks. There are many people emailing me. I'm not sure. We're all going to have to wait. But I thought it was interesting to hear the Prime Minister reflect on why and how he is choosing to wear masks right now. And I know we have a camera headed up to catch him on his way in. We've seen him a few times wearing masks, namely at the funeral, the memorial that was held for the people that for the helicopter crash. This picture here was when he was talking to Ottawa Public Health officials. Again, a little bit limited in terms of space, but he's also wearing it a little more regularly when he feels like he can't maintain that physical distancing, which would fall in line with what Dr. Tam has been saying. But it was interesting to hear him reflect on that nonetheless, Vashi.
Yeah, and he said that basically, like, for example, today he's going into the committee, which is in person in Parliament, and then evolves into a sitting, and he'll wear the mask. He said when he, on his way there, when he enters the building, he'll take it off when he has appropriate physical distancing in order to, take part in that committee and answer questions or what have it. And then he'll put it back on as he exits or as soon as that part is done. I think that the guidance from Dr. Tam is highly anticipated, and I would say that only because we've seen in other jurisdictions there be sort of blanket directions. You should be wearing them if you go here, if you go there. It's very clear. It's especially important, I think, for that question to be answered succinctly and explicitly by public health officials, and they have been talking. They have talked in the past month or so about here's what it does and when it might be appropriate to use it. But if there was an explicit sort of piece of advice or direction or whatever it ends up being called, I think as businesses reopen, it's especially important because we've heard from a number of businesses who are confused about what they should be doing, what they should be expecting, and from people who are confused about what they should be doing when they're shopping or when they're going into retail outlets. I even talked to Toronto Mayor John Tory last week, who was specifically calling for exactly this, some very concrete advice or guidance from public health officials that is consistently applied. And he said that consistency is what is most important. So I'm eagerly awaiting hearing from Dr. Tam on that as well.
Yeah, and they would have had to, Dr. Tam speaks with her her provincial counterparts, and they would have had to all sort of agree on where they want to be on the advice around masks. Of course, it took a while for any advice to be given at all in this country. Culturally, we are not used to wearing masks around, although you certainly see it a fair bit right now. But it'll be interesting to see whether it is sort of mandatory, as we've seen in some countries and some other jurisdictions like New York, and then where it's mandatory, if it's on transit, in stores, all that kind of stuff, David. I mean, obviously you see people more and more wearing them. Sometimes in places where you're confused about why are you wearing a mask in the park where there's nobody near you. But nonetheless, it would be good to get a clear advice on that so that we can all make the best decisions.
Yeah, I'm unclear on the jurisdictional enforcement of any kind of mask guidance, whether that would actually fall to the provincial health authorities or even the local health authorities. I suspect that may be the approach. The way the Public Health Agency of Canada has operated on a lot of these things is to try to provide a national benchmark guidance and then have it strengthened or reduced based on the local circumstances. Whatever the advice is coming from Dr. Tam, I can't imagine it's going to be scaling back on when to wear a mask. It's undoubtedly going to be an escalation, and I think the Prime Minister wearing a mask as he went into Parliament today, a guy who's comfortable in the symbolism of his job, that was definitely a symbolic gesture to try to show to the country that this is what you need to do. So the science and opinion on this from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Here's a video. Our colleague Matthew Theriault raced up to get that picture. He was running the camera here for me, Rosie, and we heard this was going to happen. He ran and got his gear, went up to Parliament Hill, and there's
that kind of guy.
The Prime Minister, not the sort of thing we see, right? The head of the Canadian government wearing a black mask, wandering on into Parliament through, we're used to seeing the Prime Minister getting out of an SUV with security around him. To keep him safe, but never wearing a mask. Not necessarily to keep him safe, but to keep the others around him safe. Because this is the public health guidance from a lot of experts on masks, is that my mask keeps you safe, your mask keeps me safe. Having a very clear set of guidelines coming from Dr. Tam with that visible example of the Prime Minister there is going to be an interesting message to send to the country as more and more parts of Canada tentatively reopen economically. Those workers, you see, every time you go for your groceries or you go to refill your prescriptions, they deserve whatever protection the country can give them. And even if it's marginal or major, it's not too much of a sacrifice to ask people to take when you look at the risk that often minimum wage workers are taking to provide essential services to the country.
Yeah, I should say that I think it was last week I saw there was a picture on his official photographer's Instagram account, Adam Scotty, where the Prime Minister was in the back of the SUV. Again, a very restricted space, obviously, where you're not going to get a distance from the security RCMP officials who have to be with him, RCMP officers who have to be with him, and he was wearing a mask in the back there too. So
and there's plexiglass and stuff, I think, separating the back
or some
seat.
sort of sheeting or something that was so you can see the way that he too was having to adapt his life. I mean, I get the other issue, I guess, would be where are you getting the masks? There are non-medical grade masks, but I know for me it took me about a month to get any masks arriving at my house. So it is an issue about how people are, whether they can procure them, where they come from, if you work, if you're at a business where you have to wear them, does the company provide them, all those issues. Okay, Dr. Tam is arriving here, so we will wait to hear what her advice is. I will come back to both of you. Thank you so much. And we will also, of course, take you inside the House of Commons when that gets underway as well. But we don't want to miss out on what Dr. Tam has to say. We'll pull away from this once the Prime Minister starts, if need be, and then we can always come back to it. She's getting herself organized here. But it is just public health officials today at this briefing, giving that ministers will be inside the House of Commons, taking their questions. Here's Dr. Teresa
Good afternoon and bonjour à toutes et à tous. We will start with the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 79,491 cases, including 5,955 deaths, and 40,342, or 51%, have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 1,372,000 people for testing, and to date, with about 5% of these testing positive overall. And we're now testing an average of 28,000 or so people a day. These numbers change quickly and are updated regularly on canada.ca/coronavirus. As Canada's COVID-19 epidemic continues to slow and provinces and territories proceed with careful reopening plans, we are thinking more and more about how to proceed through the spring and summer months and what to plan for in the fall. Vigilance and patience will be our biggest virtues during this time. Until effective therapies or a vaccine is widely available, our aim must be to carefully balance the direct risks associated with the COVID-19 epidemic activity with the unintended health, social, and economic consequences. That means reopening to lessen negative consequences while maintaining core public health practices to keep COVID-19 activity to a low level. For the spring and summer months, strict adherence to the public health basics of physical distancing, hand washing, and cough etiquette must continue as the bare minimum. In addition, where COVID-19 activity is occurring, use of non-medical masks or face coverings is recommended as an added layer of protection when physical distancing is difficult to maintain. And staying home when sick is a must, always and everywhere. We will be posting updated federal, provincial, territorial special advisory committee on COVID-19's recommendation on the non-medical masks today. If we can all maintain these measures to the best of our ability, we stand the best chance of keeping COVID-19 activity down through the spring and summer. This will give us more lead time to work on full range of preparedness activities in readiness for whatever may come this fall and winter. As well, suppressing disease activity throughout the summer will continue to buy time for research and innovation on medical therapies and vaccine development. I know this may not be the grand reopening we might have liked, but we won't get through this on hope alone. For the weeks and months ahead, we'll need to continue to prop each other up with creativity, kindness, and patience. When it comes to summer reopening, keeping our 2 meters is a must. Outside spaces are better than inside. Small bubbles of core contacts are better than big. And good hand washing is the right accessory for all venues and occasions. Thank you. Merci.
Bonjour. Good afternoon. As usual, I will start with the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 79,491 cases, including 5,955 deaths and 40,342, or 51%, now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 1,372,000 people for testing, and about 5% with about 5% testing positive overall. We are now testing an average of 28,000 people daily. These numbers change quickly and are updated regularly on canada.ca/coronavirus. As Canada's COVID-19 epidemic continues to slow and provinces and territories proceed with careful reopening plans, we are thinking more and more about how to proceed through the spring and the summer months, and what to plan for in the fall. Vigilance and patience will be our biggest virtues during this time. Until effective therapies or a vaccine is widely available, our aim must be to carefully balance the direct risks associated with COVID-19 epidemic activity with the unintended health, social, and economic consequences. That means reopening to lessen negative consequences while maintaining core public health practices to keep COVID-19 activity to a low level. For the spring and summer months, strict adherence to the public health basics of physical distancing, hand washing, and cough etiquette must continue as the bare minimum. In addition, where COVID-19 activity is occurring, use of non-medical masks or face coverings is recommended as an added layer of protection when physical distancing is difficult to maintain. And staying home, we will be publishing recommendations today. And staying home when sick is a must, always and everywhere. If we can all maintain these measures to the best of our ability, we stand the best chance of keeping COVID-19 activity down through the spring and summer. This will give us more lead time to work on a full range of preparedness activities in readiness for whatever may come this fall and winter. As well, suppressing disease activity throughout the summer will continue to buy time for research and innovation on medical therapies and vaccine development. We know this may not be the grand reopening we might have liked, but we will not get through this on hope alone. For the weeks and months ahead, we'll need to continue to prop each other up with creativity, kindness, and patience. When it comes to summer reopening, keeping our 2 meters distance is a must. Outside spaces are better than inside. Small bubbles of core contacts are better than big, and good hand washing is the right accessory for all venues and occasions. Thank you.
We will now open the telephone line and the floor to questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions dans l'une des 2 langues officielles. Nous vous demandons de vous limiter à une question et une question de suivi. For those who wish to ask a question in the room, please make your way over to the freely standing mic. We will start on the phone as usual. Over to you, operator.
Merci. Thank you. The next question is from Lina Dib. Please go ahead. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Oui, bonjour. Dr. New,
Good morning. Dr. New, could you explain the difference, please, between what you're saying now recommending that non-medical masks be worn, and what you were saying up till now about masks. I don't quite understand the nuance. Could you please explain it? Answer. Thank you for the question. In fact, there isn't that much difference between what Dr. Tam and I have already said. We are continuing our conversations with our provincial and territorial counterparts. And with the science evolving, we're saying that it is a supplementary measure. As we've said many times, medical grade masks must be reserved for healthcare workers. But for the general public, if we find ourselves in circumstances in which it's not possible to maintain 2 meters of distance from other people, it is an extra layer of protection. And it depends on the circumstances too, however. The epidemiology varies from one region to another. Obviously, if you're using public transportation in Montreal, that is a completely different situation from being in the Yukon, up north. Thank you.
Okay, maybe my next one would be for you, Dr. Tam. So what exactly has changed for you now to say we recommend? Because you were saying that the mask does not protect the person that was wearing it. I am assuming that this is still the case. So what has changed for you now to go the extra step and not just say this is a good idea, this can be done. Now it is we recommend that you do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's so the specific recommendation, if you like, as opposed to be, I think the previous language was more permissive. So I think just to rewind a little bit, the Chief Medical Officer's position from the start was that, of course, these masks protect others. So if you're wearing it, you're protecting other people against your droplets. So at the start, it was obviously someone who is sick, who's coughing or sneezing. If they're going to go out or have to go to a medical appointment, for example, they need to cover the cough and with facial covering or mask. That is for the sick person. So it's when we got more evidence about asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic individuals, and that although we don't fully understand their role in transmission, it is an added layer of protection, even for people who don't have symptoms, to wear a mask to prevent transmission to others. And even though the evidence base hasn't changed too much, and particularly as people have generally been staying at home, and now that we're sort of reopening or restarting a lot of the activities, the Chief Medical Officers felt that they can recommend this for people who cannot maintain that 2-meter distance. And more specifically, if there's virus in your, there's been community transmission in your jurisdiction. And as Dr. News said, jurisdictions felt that they need to do that risk assessment because there's some provinces and territories that haven't had community transmission, and others who have clearly have and continue to have community transmission activities. So they will do their individual risk assessments in terms of the very specific recommendations locally. But I think that, from our perspective, it is an added layer of protection. It is for you to protect others. So if 2 people are wearing masks, I'm protecting you and you're protecting me. And so I think as more people do go out in the community, you can imagine there'll be more people on public transport, or maybe more people, some of the retail stores are beginning to open, for example. And if you can't predict whether you can maintain that 2-meter distance, then it's recommended that you wear the non-medical mask or facial covering.
Merci, Doctor. Next question, operator.
Merci, thank you. The next question is from Mike Blanchfield from the Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I guess this is a question for Dr. Tam. We've seen radically different approaches in the provinces, 2 largest provinces, Ontario and Quebec, on reopening, especially when it comes to schooling, and we heard what Doug Ford said yesterday. How do you explain the differences an approach to reopening, easing of restrictions in these two highly afflicted and Canada's two largest provinces?
So at the federal level and working with the province territories, essentially the chief medical officers, we have provided guidance and criteria. But obviously the provinces want to retain their own ability to adjust their approaches. As I think even in the global context, I don't know that there's an absolute white pathway down this curve, as I've said. People have to do whatever they do cautiously and slowly using the best information they have in their own particular contexts. And that if they were reopening or loosening certain measures, they need to have the necessary systems to detect whether that has led to any increase in cases or clusters. So I think whatever pathway down this curve, there is no one-size-fits-all, and there is a certain element of uncertainty. But if you do it more cautiously and monitor it and adjust as needed, that is the key principle.
Thank you. Follow-up?
All right. Well, how do you square the differences anyway? I mean, they're two very similar provinces, similar sets of circumstances. Does it surprise you from a scientific point of view that two extremely different conclusions can be reached under these circumstances?
Well, I think as the local jurisdictions, one aspect which I'm not sure is particularly evident is that I think public health is also trying to take a holistic approach, not just balancing the sort of effective public health measures, but also looking at the negative consequences as well. You need to have some balance. You need to bring back certain activities and certain measures, getting people outside, for instance. The outside is less risk because we know transmission generally occurs, and particularly transmission to large numbers of people occurs indoors. And so I think all of those has to be taken into account. But in some areas, there may be a good reason why certain things are being opened, and in order to support the community in their local context as well. And there's a balance between the need to reduce the spread of disease compared to all the other needs from a health, social, and economic perspective.
Yeah, and Dr. New, I just maybe would add that even within any province, you can see the differences because obviously the provincial authorities know more what's happening on the ground than Dr. Tam and myself. They have the data. They know what's actually happening on the ground. And so we can see in the province of Quebec that what's happening on the island of Montreal and how they may be relaxing their measures, maybe in a slower fashion based on the epidemiology of what's happening in Montreal as compared to the rest of the province of Quebec. That's a prime example that even within a province that there needs to be a careful look at, obviously taking into account what's happening locally to make the best possible decisions based on what they know in terms of the epidemiology. Thank you.
Thank you. Upper next question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question, Marie Vastel, Le Devoir. La parole est à vous.
Next question, Le Devoir.
Hi, Dr.
Question.
Tam. My question is for you. I think I have an idea of the answer, but I would like to hear you explain why is your recommendation today on non-surgical masks? Why is it only a recommendation, and why are you not making it mandatory Canada-wide to wear a mask when we go outside? Is it a question of jurisdiction? Is it a question of there just wouldn't be enough masks to make it mandatory? Is it a question of rights? Can you explain why it remains only a recommendation?
Yeah, so at the national level, it remains a recommendation, and as the medical officers of health needs to look at their own particular context in terms of whether they actually have evidence of community transmission, and some areas actually don't and have actually never had community transmission. It's very different from, say, maybe, as Dr. New said, comparing Montreal and Toronto to Yukon or the PEI might actually be very different. So they need that ability to make those recommendations. Their public transportation systems might be different, for example. And so they need the ability to do that risk assessment and recommend it from their perspective. From the federal perspective, Transport Canada, of course, given that's their federal jurisdiction, did make the wearing of non-medical mask mandatory on those conveyances. So that is within the federal jurisdiction.
And Dr. You maybe I'll just add, certainly understand the interest in terms of the use of non-medical masks, by the general public. But one of the issues we're also obviously with our counterparts in the provinces and territories looking at closely is that the unintended consequences, where if you people think that by wearing a mask in public, they don't need to follow all of the other important public health measures that we've been underlining so many times in terms of guarding, the distance, the physical distancing of 2 meters, etc. So that's one of the things I think we still need to underline, that this is, quote, a supplementary measure that people can use to protect themselves when it's difficult to maintain that physical distancing of 2 meters, but it certainly does not replace all of the other good measures such as hand washing, etc. Thank you.
Thanks. And as a follow-up, sorry, there's an echo. As a follow-up, Dr. Tam, so as you mentioned previously, it was already suggested to wear a non-medical mask when we go outside. Now it's recommended, but in places like Quebec, for example, it has been recommended, strongly recommended, for a week already, and we see that people are not necessarily wearing it outside at the grocery store or in other locations where they can't social distance. So what exactly can you do as public health officials to ensure that something actually changes on the ground? Your language is changing, but people aren't wearing it more.
I can't speak to the very local jurisdiction, and they will adjust their approach as needed. But I think from certain public opinion research, etc., Canadians are wearing more masks, and they are more. The social cultural shift is beginning to occur. So part of what public health is doing is, the concept is one, I think, of reciprocal protection. So I think for Canadians, thinking of it as I'm protecting you and you're protecting me is a very key concept. We have to gain the trust of the Canadian public and get their buy-in to do all of this. Mandating is one measure, which some jurisdictions might take if they have to. But for the most part, I do think that the shift is occurring in the population as well, which I think is great.
Thank you, Doctor. We'll now turn to the room. First question.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Tam. It's Ryan Templeton with the National Post. The Pan-Canadian Public Health Care Network, which you're chair of, wrote a report in 2016 called A Blueprint for a Federated System of Public Health Surveillance. It recommended that provinces and the feds work closer together. It said there were gaps in how they share data. It said there were differences in how they collect data. I'm wondering sort of what progress has been made on implementing that report's recommendations to a more aligned system between the provinces and the federal government.
Yes, so I think data is extremely important, obviously, to any outbreak, and pandemic is to this scale. From a regular outbreak perspective, we have some very well-run mechanisms. So foodborne outbreaks being a very key concept of this is that we react very fast. Information is shared, but something of this scale in the respiratory domain, there's obviously some gaps, particularly reporting to the national level, that we do have to address. Some of it is timeliness, but some of the fields cannot be completed by the jurisdictions at the moment when we look at the completion rates. So we are actively trying very hard to figure out, well, what is needed? Is it more support at different levels? Can the system be made more efficient? Because efficiency in the system helps our frontline public health workers as well, who are very busy doing certain things. that there may be system efficiencies. Of course, the data comes from many different areas. It's the complexity of the Canadian landscape of data, I think. Some data has to come from hospitals. It has to come from labs. It has to come from local public health units. And so, but I think it is absolutely recognized, and also at the First Minister's level, that this is absolutely another chance for us to improve on what we're doing. But you know, I think capitalizing on the sort of crisis that we have, we need to give it another good go for the next piece.
Thank you. Follow up?
Yeah, I'm wondering, what are sort of the barriers in bringing this data together? Is it jurisdictional? Is it that provinces don't want to ease up on their control over healthcare? And also, do you think not having shared data has hindered our ability to respond to this pandemic?
So it is a federated system, and the public health system is a local level up system. And we collaborate to get data. So that's always been the construct, is one of a collaborative approach. And so the most important thing, of course, is at the local level, they have the data that they need to actually respond to the identification of cases and the follow-up of contacts, which we all know is very important. That's the key. So then is the reporting then from the local jurisdiction to the provincial level. That has to be that is under the jurisdiction of the province and territories. From the province to the federal level, because we at the federal level don't do the day-to-day case management, that the data is needed, and the data is useful to the local jurisdictions, and they have been actioning. They have been providing advice, public health advice, based on the local level information. But it is important to get the national picture and to be able to provide that to policymakers as well. So I think we have the basic information, but I think what people needed and is asking for now is more what we call this aggregation, more in-depth analysis. We have things like age or sex, but there is a need to have First Nations, Inuit, Métis data, as well as race or ethnicity-based data as well. So those are the kind of things that we need to work on, because if you're fine-tuning your policies to support vulnerable populations, that's important. We do know, of course, we have data, for example, to provide measures or policies or programs to those most at risk, which is the seniors and the people with underlying medical conditions, et cetera. So the kind of data is available and is driving the response right now, as you can see in the different jurisdictions in long-term care. But I think it is important to take that next stage so that we have a more in-depth analysis to further support particularly vulnerable populations.
Thank you. Next question, CTV.
Hi, doctors. Molly Thomas, CTV National News. Dr. Tam, I understand, more evidence of asymptomatic symptoms has influenced the mask recommendation, but did we drop the ball here? I mean, I think of smaller countries, the Czech Republic, Vietnam, even Venezuela have had mandatory masks in place for quite some time. Do you regret this decision, and could we have prevented the spread here if it was a different decision?
Well, I think the decision was taken to essentially ask people to stay at home, and the quarantine periods, the isolation of cases and quarantining of contact has been the mainstay of the recommendation. So we have effectively stopped and decelerated that epidemic wave. So that actually has been effective. So when I say the tried and true public health measures, those are the identification of cases, contacts, isolation, quarantine, hand washing, physical distancing has worked. But so this is an added layer on top of that. And I do think that it is important as we begin to reopen. Now, people no longer staying at home. More people will be going outside. Public transit may be more crowded as a result. This will help us reopen and add another layer to that. How do you go out safely message, I think. But the message to the Canadians must remain all of those, previous measures with this as an added layer of protection. And so then we will still have to collect some information. The kind of data to show the efficacy of the non-medical mask on top of everything else might actually be quite difficult to discern because multiple things are happening. But it would be very interesting still to try and look in the Canadian context what this has produced as people adopt this measure more widely.
So no regrets?
We need to flexibly, change our measures as we get more information. But as I've just said, it's always been, if you were infectious, that was at the beginning when we thought that the majority had symptoms, you do put a face covering on to prevent transmission. If you're even at home looking after a sick person, there's distancing, but the mask. So I think adding on this layer as we learn more was the appropriate thing to do. And I think we need to focus on the here and now. The whole hindsight thing, people can review, but maybe on all future respiratory outbreaks, this will be the actual norm to do. And so I think we need to sort of look forwards to what might be the approach in Canada going forwards.
About testing. So you said on average we're testing about 28,000 people a day. A week and a half ago I talked to you, I think it was 26,000 on average. So we're like a slow crawl up to that goal of 60,000. What is the holdup here?
So 60,000 is the capacity that is already there for public health labs. So your question is, why are we only doing, 28 or maybe higher? Some days it is higher. This is a bit of an average. This is something that at the highest levels of governments, people are seized with. A lot of this, in talking to the chief medical officer, for example, in British Columbia, they just said that their level of infection has really come down. There's no one with much in the way of respiratory illness. They will, of course, widen, everybody is widening their community testing to include even mild symptoms. And sometimes people are not actually showing up. And so it depends, I think, on the access, the uptake of the testing on the ground, not necessarily because they don't have the capacity, but also because of what the local medical officers feel to be in line with where they are in the epidemic. But having said that, we looking at absolutely how do we appropriately increase testing. For example, you've seen in certain provinces, they're looking at the vulnerable settings, long-term care, where they are looking at testing people in that setting, whether they're symptomatic or not, and the people who work there. So there's also systematic pilots or surveillance being done in different jurisdictions, and we're going to share that information across the country to see if people can learn from each other as to what's the appropriate area for increasing testing. So all that is at play, but the key is that you need to have a sensitive enough system to detect any resurgence of cases and then clamp down on the contact. So that is the fundamental principle.
Thank you. Next question, Toronto Star.
Dr. Tam, hi, Tonda McCharles with the Star. Well, that leads to what I was going to ask you about, but so specifically, since you've talked so much today on so many topics about the need to respect jurisdictions, I'm curious, what exactly are the elements that the federal level has proposed as a national framework on testing and contact tracing that the Prime Minister said was tabled last week to provinces?
So I think all provinces and territories know that some of the three fundamental aspects, so the criteria and the indicators are sort of laid down in the recommendations or the guidance of the Special Advisory Committee, which is the Public Health Foundation, for which testing, contact tracing, and then isolation and quarantine is the fundamental public health underpinnings or principle for this next phase. So everybody knows that that is absolutely critical. everybody knows that we have to increase capacity to detect any resurgence and build the capacity towards any potential increase if we're to see that in the fall. We hope that we can sort of clamp down on, any sparks and introductions. So the suppression of any sparks is really key. I think the federal government's key role is, I think the Prime Minister has offered resources, support to the provinces as needed to ramp up their capacity. We are supporting, of course, supplies, swabs, reagents, if there's a need for any other further support as well. And, committed to, looking at what else the provinces need. We provide guidance, of course, and these are updated as appropriate. So to look at what population needs to be tested over time as well.
Actually, national framework on testing and contact tracing proposed then. Is it overstating the case to say that a framework on how testing and contact tracing should go forward? You've just referred to guidelines and criteria that you came up with weeks ago. So has there something new been put on the table or no?
So I think that speaks to a higher level commitment that is a wider strategy. I think that is not just, of course, the technical guidance, but looking at supplies and other resources and support that would be required. But fundamentally, we've always had a strategy for laboratory testing, which is founded on public health guidance. And that changes over time. So at the beginning, it was targeted more at travelers because of that's where the epidemiology is at. At the peak of the epidemic, it is focused, and people are asked to stay at home, and if they have mild symptoms. And so at that stage, the testing approach, the strategy, is focused on the sickest people and areas of outbreaks like long-term care and healthcare workers. As we begin to get this first wave under control and into this recovery, reopening phase, is about widening then that testing, for example, to people with mild symptoms who would never sort of in the previous phase was necessarily tested. Now we're expanding the testing to particularly symptomatic but with mild symptoms, as well as a very low threshold for testing everybody under certain high-risk settings, whether it be long-term care, acute care, correctional services, shelters, indigenous populations that are at higher risk of the severe impacts. And so this is fundamental to the strategy. And also then, how do we widen surveillance and having surveillance systems which are built upon respiratory illness surveillance, but maybe there are other surveillance approaches that we can take. We call those pilots or surveillance activities, which can take into account, for example, the testing of asymptomatic people. So that is the actual approach which varies and will be adapted. So I think is an adaptive testing strategy, which is now moving into the next phase. At the same time as doing that, ramping up our capacity in every single channel that we can. So the other aspect to the strategy is that right now, there are three modalities we're looking at. One, the existing ramping up of the laboratory-based PCR testing. That is the key to testing whether you have the infection now. Widening that from the lab-based to point of care. So that's part of the strategy, getting point of care tests, getting supplies, particularly to cover the rural and more remote areas. That is still a work in progress. We're getting Gene Expert and Expert Express SARS-CoV-2 test kits now. You've seen the La Loche, you've seen Nunavut and others having these supplies. So point of care, particularly to cover those areas, very important. Thirdly, you've heard the immunity task force. Serology will become the third component of the testing strategy. The primary key aspect of that, as you've probably already heard, is to conduct those sero surveys, which we believe will be conducted pretty fast, to uncover how much of the population, what's the prevalence, and how much of the population has been infected. That is important for policy decisions, not just now, but as we get a vaccine, for example, in the future, to know what the population immunity is and where we might be going with vaccination strategies.
Okay, I'm going to briefly pull away from the Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Teresa Tam, who is giving some interesting answers there around what we need to do for testing and how we are working to expand that. But I wanted to just touch on the evolution of the advice on mask wearing in this country. It's been about 6 weeks since we got the last suggestion from federal public health officials on how we should approach masks in Canada. And now it has changed so slightly today, but in an important way. Dr. Iris Gorfunkel is a family physician, and she joins us from Toronto. Good to see you, Doctor.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
No problem. So thanks for standing by. So the shift today, for people that might not have been able to detect it, was before it was suggested that a non-medical mask would be helpful if you were in places where you couldn't get that 2 meters of physical distance, and now it is a recommendation. Does that seem to you to make a significant difference to regular people, and how big a deal is that, do you think?
I think the message has to be, I protect you by wearing my mask, and you protect me by wearing your mask. We know that asymptomatic transmission is a real problem, and up to 50% of individuals may actually carry COVID-19 and not even be aware of it. So bearing that in mind, wearing the mask is an important societal message as well as a huge health impact to reduce the COVID-19 as we reopen.
One of the things Dr. Tam talked about was sort of building trust between Canadians, which I realize is a really fundamental part of public health and how you approach public health, and that she herself had seen a shift in Canadians. Is that why it's not needed yet to go to a mandatory requirement for wearing masks?
It's interesting. There are actually 30 countries now that make it mandatory to wear. But we don't need 100% compliance. If we had 80% compliance and the masks were only 60% helpful, these are the numbers, we would stop the spread of COVID-19. So with our societal freedoms, it's possible to do. But the message has to be, I care enough about my fellow man to do that. The masks are not going to protect me from getting it, but it will protect other people from getting it. And that's why it's so important.
Obviously, this is the recommendation now, but of course, the pandemic looks different depending on where you live. And in Quebec, for instance, they strongly recommended this some time ago because it has been more severe on the island of Montreal. Does that complicate factors that it is so different across the country, or should we all just be wearing one and get over it?
Well, the thing about it is, COVID-19 has been so humbling. It's not there until it's there. And what we've realized is that, looking overseas and saying, oh, it's not us, it rapidly became us. And it can spread from province to province, especially as travel is opening. So I think the idea of a broad acceptance of the use of masks, independent of how common it is right now, would make a lot of sense. Because we've been humbled. It changes, and it can change rapidly.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that we are seeing economies reopen across the country in a significant way in some places, less significant in others, does the timing seem right then for you as we all start to emerge from our homes?
Absolutely. The timing makes a lot of sense. And in fact, I think what would even make more sense is when kids get back to school in the fall, all the kids should be wearing masks because they are potentially carriers of COVID-19 to much higher risk patient populations. So I think we need to even take it to the next step. And I recognize the fall is a long time away from now, but just thinking in terms of when large masses of people are coming back and congregating, masks have been shown to make a substantial difference. If we look, for example, at Hong Kong or Singapore, countries where the acceptance of it is almost 100%, the death rate from COVID-19 has plummeted. And now we're pushing 6,000 Canadian lives lost. So this is a huge impact.
Hard to get kids to wear a mask all day. Geez, I might have to start training them through the summer. I'll end on this, Doctor. The Prime Minister made a point today of talking about his personal decision on wearing a mask, and also then, we saw him going into Parliament wearing a mask. How significant is it for leaders to be demonstrating that right now?
I think it's tremendously important. And I think that also what happens is once we reach a certain tipping point, shall we say, if over 50% of people start wearing masks, what happens is I'll become the odd man out if I'm not wearing masks.
Right.
So as more and more people define it as the norm, it becomes the norm. And that's precisely what we saw in China happening around SARS. So they've learned from SARS, and now they rapidly have adopted it. So just like any kind of, I hate to use the word fashion statement, but it is somewhat of that. There's a societal pressure that actually works. I care about you, you care about me, and this is what I do.
Yep. Okay, Doctor, thank you. I do appreciate you weighing in very much. Thank you. Dr. Iris Gorfinkel, she's a family physician in Toronto. Thanks, Doctor. Okay, and as we stand by and wait for this committee to get underway, they are still reading petitions. Parliamentary work is sometimes long. I'll bring back my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapelis, and the CBC's David Cochrane. So maybe not, breaking the walls down, exciting mask news, but it was a shift, and an important one at that, in terms of it becoming now a recommendation for Canadians to wear masks when they can't get the physical distance required, those 2 meters of distance. Also interesting, though, to hear Dr. Tam talk at length about, okay, I'm sorry, it's not going to happen. I'm going to go back to the West Block, where we are getting to the question and answer period of this special committee. So let's bring you in to that now. Live, here is the Leader of the Official Opposition, Andrew Scheer.
And are expecting their elected representatives to do the same. Next week, Quebec's National Assembly will sit 3 times a week, and then 4 times a week in June. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians why he believes that we should not go back to work here in the House of Commons? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, for a number of weeks, we've been sitting 3 times a week, twice virtually, to allow all MPs across the country, not just those who live in Ottawa, to be able to take part in the sittings of the House and represent their constituents. We will continue to ensure that our Parliament can function, even if this is a pandemic crisis.
Speaker, the Prime Minister knows that the House is not sitting normally. This is a committee of the whole. It's not the normal way that the House of Commons does its business, and the Prime Minister should acknowledge that. Mr. Speaker, I've raised the issue of Brant Tractor in my riding numerous times with the Prime Minister, and I'd like to do so again today because as Conservatives have been asking for weeks for the Liberals to amend the wage subsidy to allow companies that have acquired another company to compare their revenues based on the combined revenues of those 2 previous companies. Last week, the government announced a change to eligibility to the wage subsidy for companies formed by an amalgamation, but not for acquisitions. There are many employees whose jobs depend on the answer to this question, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister confirm whether these same rules will be extended to acquisitions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in response to the Honourable Member's first comment, these are not normal times. We are in a pandemic situation where Canadians are having to adjust many different ways. And at the same time, it is important that we keep our parliamentary institutions going, that we provide opportunities for MPs to ask questions on behalf of their constituents of the government. And that's why we have had 3 sittings a week over the past number of weeks. In regards to the business in the member opposite's riding, I can highlight that finance officials have been in touch with that company, and we continue to look at ways of closing further gaps. Even as we've helped millions of Canadians and hundreds of thousands of companies, there is more to do, and we will keep working on that.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Speaker, in March of 2019, the rating agency Fitch issued a warning about Canada's overall government debt level. They said that Canada's gross general government debt remains close to a level that is, quote, incompatible with AAA status. Now, we all know what that means. If our credit is downgraded, that will mean taxpayers will pay more to service the cost of that debt. Can the Prime Minister tell the House how much it will cost Canadians in additional debt servicing charges if Canada's credit rating is downgraded?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there are only 2 G7 countries that have unanimous AAA credit ratings for their economic and fiscal management going into this crisis. That is Germany and Canada. We have a perfect score in terms of credit agencies because we have managed to keep our debt as a size of our GDP under control. We were responsible over the past 5 years, which means that when this pandemic has hit us, we have had the means to invest to help directly millions upon millions of Canadians who needed that help.
Mr. Scheer.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, the exact opposite is true. Remember, when this government was first elected, they promised that the deficits would be small and temporary, just $10 billion a year for 4 years. Then they had to throw away that metric, and they said, well, as long as our debt to GDP ratio remains constant, that would be okay. Well, we all know that the economic output has shrunk. Meanwhile, the spending, even before this pandemic, was going through the roof. Remember, it was this government that said Loblaws deserved $12 million for new fridges, and MasterCard, a credit card company, deserved $50 million in corporate bailouts. This government made Canada weak heading into this pandemic, and all this additional spending that is being borrowed to provide assistance to Canadians is coming on the heels of record deficits and is hurting Canada's ability to maintain its credit rating. Now, one of the ways that you can protect your credit rating is if you show the people you owe the money to how you're going to pay it back. So is the government willing to provide Canadians with an update as to how they will get Canada's fiscal track back under control when this pandemic is over?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's déjà vu all over again. We've heard yet again the same economic arguments that the Conservatives have been making for years. They made them in the 2015 election where we proposed to invest in Canadians, and they talked about debt reduction and austerity. They lost that election. Then in 2019, after 4 years of demonstrating that investing in Canadians not only could create over 1 million new jobs, but lift over 1 million Canadians out of poverty, they continued to make those same tired arguments and were rejected once again by Canadians. We have demonstrated that fiscal responsibility, that managing our finances properly while investing in Canadians has been the responsible thing to do and left us the fiscal firepower to invest in Canadians during this pandemic.
That's right.
Nous allons continuer maintenant.
We will now continue with Mr. Blanchet. Mr. Blanchet. Thank you, Chair. We had agreed to put in place special rules so that we could ensure that we would have representation of each political party, 32 MPs, and I would invite us to count how many we are. The NDP is respecting the numbers. The Bloc Québécois is respecting the numbers. The Green Party is also respecting the number. The others are not. Either this is equal, or it's safety, or it's both. And it's not right now. So, that said, why have an agreement when you're not going to respect it? The government made 2 very formal commitments on April 29th with regard to creating incentives for jobs for people who are getting the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. This has not been resolved or respected, and yet had been said very clearly. One moment, please.
Okay, we're going to pull away from this question and answer period. You can continue to watch it if you want on our website, cbc.ca/politics. There's a lot of talk about whether the House of Commons should resume in some form on Monday, because that's when the time runs out for that to happen. So those negotiations continue. There's some change to the mask wearing advice in this country. It is now a recommendation that you wear it. Wear one if you cannot maintain that 2 meters of physical distancing. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thanks for watching my coverage here today, but I'm going to hand it over now to Andrew Nichols here on CBC News Network. Andrew.
Rosie, thank you. This is CBC News Network. We're tracking the very latest on the developments on the COVID-19 story, that new advice that the federal government has on wearing masks that Rosie was just mentioning. And we'll get to provincial updates throughout the afternoon. This is the scene, though, in Halifax that we want to show you. Any moment now, a representative